All right, we did not do it in the previous section, so let's go ahead and apply the scale to all these. So to do that, I can just come in here in the collection and say right-click and say select objects, and then we can do apply scale, and that should do that. That should apply it to all the rigid bodies. All right, in this lecture, we're going to create the constraints. So the constraints are going to be, the names are going to be preceded with a hashtag. So the first one we want to make is, we're going to set up the torsion or the rear suspension here. So I'm going to come into a side view. I'm going to move my cursor to the world origin again with Shift S. And I'm going to do Shift A, and our constraints are going to be empties, arrows, empty arrows. So here's my first one. I'm going to move it to the front of this trailing arm mesh here. And I'm going to call it hashtag # trailing arm. Okay. And this one is actually going to be a generic spring because we're going to put the spring and the constraints all in the same one here. Let me make sure I have this in the right position. I do not. Let me put it in rear suspension, and I'm going to select rear suspension here. Okay, so let's come over here to the physics, and we're going to make it a rigid body constraint. It's not going to be fixed. We're going to do a generic spring. And the limits we want are angular. It's going to be rotating about the X, but we can apply some angular limits. We don't know what they're going to be quite yet, so let's just leave it at default. But we want these other angular limits to be 0. We don't want it rotating about the Z or the Y. Same thing with linear. We don't want this moving at all. So I'm going to make all these values 0. All right, come down to objects, and we want to connect this from our CG to our trailing arm rigid bodies. And with the springs, we only want one spring. We want angular X angle. So I'm going to check that. And just somewhat arbitrarily, I'm going to make this 10,000 and the damping 1,000. Okay, so that should set up our trailing arm. Next, we want to do a rear axle constraint. So I'm going to put my cursor at this rear wheel, Shift S, cursor to selected. Then I'm going to do Shift A and make another empty arrows. We're going to use a hinge, and hinges are, their degree of freedom is along the Z axis. So we want to rotate this. So I'm going to do R, Y, 90. So now the Z axis is in the same direction, or is parallel to the rotational axis of the wheel, and we can make it a rigid body constraint. So let's make it a hinge, and we don't want any angle limits, and we want to attach it to the trailing arm and then to our wheel over here. Okay, and let's make sure to name this. This is going to be hashtag rear axle. Okay. And again, we could mirror this, or we can just make another one. Let's just make another one. I'm going to move my cursor to this one, cursor to selected, then Shift A, empty arrows. I'm going to R, Y, 90 to rotate it. And I'm going to name it. We'll just call it the same, or hashtag, sorry. Hashtag rear axle. It's going to automatically index the other one, which is fine. And we want to make it a rigid body constraint, and it's going to be a hinge. And we want the first object to be the trailing arm, second object to be the rear wheel. There we go. All right, now let's make our motor. This is what's going to propel the vehicle forward and backwards. So again, I'm going to move my cursor here to this side, and I'm going to do Shift A. We'll make another empty arrows. I'm going to move this along the X-axis so that it's outside a little bit. Doesn't really matter where it is as long as it's parallel. I'm going to name this hashtag motor. And we need to make it a rigid body constraint. And it's going to be a motor, and it's going to be an angular motor. And we'll just arbitrarily make the target velocity 10. That's going to be in radians per second. And the max impulse 100. And that's kind of analogous to torque. And we want to attach it. So let's attach it. Same thing as the axle from the trailing arm to the rear wheel. Then I'm going to copy this, Shift D, press Escape, and make the X location negative. And all we need to do with this one is just change which rear wheel it's attached to. So I'm going to attach it to this one, the right side rear wheel. Next, we need a front axle. So I'm going to move my cursor to the front wheel, Shift S, cursor selected, then Shift A, empty, arrows, and this is going to be an axle, so we want the Z-axis aligned with the rotational axis of the front wheel, so R, Y, 90. We are going to name it. This is going to be hashtag front axle, and I'm in the wrong collection, so let me move it over here and select the front collection, the rig front suspension collection, and let's set it up. So it's going to be a rigid body constraint, of course. It's going to be a hinge, and we're going to attach it from the front hub. I think I put front hug, sorry about that, to front wheel. Let me rename that. Front hub, there we go. All right, so there's our axle. And now we need another axle for the steering. It's going to be our steering axle. So in the same position, I'm going to do Shift A, empty arrows. This is going to be our steering axle. Let's go ahead and name it hashtag steering axle. And since it's our steering, we actually want to give it a little bit of caster. So I'm going to rotate it about the X, about 15 degrees. So I'm going to do R, X, negative 15. And that's just going to give it a little bit of caster angle, kind of like a motorcycle or bicycle is set up. All right, then we need to make it a rigid body constraint. It's going to be a hinge also. And we're actually going to give it angular limits, and these are going to be the steering lock limits. We'll make it 30 degrees each way, negative 30 and 30. And the first object is going to be the CG, and the second object is going to be the front hub.